started punctually here because we've got another meeting to get to at 5 p.m. So I wanted to start by just saying the welcoming hands sculpture here is meant to be representative of a community that cares equally for all citizens. That's why we chose it as the place to have this. In my 42 years as an engaged citizen of Chico, I've seen few issues that have caused residents to question their leaders as much as the current city council's directive to repeatedly evict people experiencing homelessness from the scant sanctuary they've established with no alternative location provided. No plan in place, and an admission that the goal is to merely keep rousting them until they go elsewhere. Now, the city's been served a restraining order for what most of us already believed, that forcing people out of the most rudimentary shelter without providing them a place to exist as they are, with no barriers to access, is morally, ethically, and as the lawsuit alleges, legally wrong. We believe that this restraining order provides our fellow city councilors an opportunity to reflect on and correct the flawed decision to evict unhoused people without providing alternatives. And we call upon them to join us in working to create no barrier shelter and extending the shelter crisis declaration.
Thank you all for being here. Over the past several years, we've seen numerous attempts by advocates and service providers to fill the gaps in shelter and transitional housing that are glaring to the vast majority of us and supported by the best data available. We've seen Simplicity Village, the Orange Street Low Barrier Shelter, and other projects come forward out of necessity, only to be thwarted by lawsuits, city bureaucracy, and public dissent, the old familiar outcry of "not in my backyard." We are here today because there has never been a more prudent time for solutions-oriented thinking, and that is the exact opposite of what we are seeing in recent actions taken by your city council. We are here to set the record straight. Simply saying there is no shelter crisis or that people on our streets do not want shelter is not only false, it is harmful to the public, to service providers, and to the prospect of a community that prioritizes the well-being of every single person living in the city of Chico.
But they don't want to go to shelters, Miss Brown. What? They don't want to go to shelters. So how do we create a shelter if they won't go?
That's not the problem. Have you talked to everyone?
Yes, I have. I got video actually of it. Comanche Creek, Wing Chime, all those places, none of them want a shelter. That's true. I got video of it. Got video of it. True story.
Recently,
Hashtag fake news.
to the public by elected officials and
I don't care about them. They're lying to the people.
You don't care. They're lying to the people. As an issue of unwillingness on the
trying to
part
listen.
of people living on our streets to seek the help being offered. Let
not
me
true.
be perfectly clear here.
You touched me first.
The primary issue, which is supported by years of data and expert opinion, is that we are in an affordable housing crisis. The cost of housing and the cost of living continue to increase, and the availability of truly affordable housing cannot catch up. The political will to ensure low-income housing in our very own community is scarce, and we are even at risk of losing over 200 affordable housing units in our area. We also know that for those living on our streets, especially those who face the greatest barriers in accessing shelter and services, we have yet to make help being offered truly accessible.
Not true.
As of last year, the state of California had over 128,000 homeless individuals who are not in families with children, and over 22,000 people experiencing homelessness who are families with children. As a community, we are neither strangers to the reality of this growing crisis, nor are we alone in needing to address it with evidence-based solutions. In Butte County, as of the 2019 point-in-time survey facilitated by the Continuum of Care, there were 389 people living unsheltered in the city of Chico and 891 in Butte County. Of those 891, 628 report living in Butte County for over 3 years. These are our residents, and it's our job to respond. The decided response by your city council has has been to increase costly enforcement and to simultaneously reject sheltering solutions for those currently living on our streets. This has
That's a lie,
resulted in
too.
legal recourse, which only exacerbates the cost of enforcement without providing accessible alternatives.
In December of 2020, the newly configured City Council by majority vote passed an anti-camping ordinance that allowed Chico Police Department and city workers on January 12, 2021, to begin clearing people's places of shelter and removing personal property and debris in the 1 mile area of Bidwell Park.
Thank God.
Requests by myself and Councilmember Brown, as well as from numerous community members, to postpone evictions until an alternative camping site was established, were rejected by the council majority in favor of expedited evictions. In the ensuing weeks, a number of tent villages in other locations were similarly eliminated. During that time, and at virtually every meeting since, a variety of alternative locations have been proposed, each time summarily rejected by the council majority. As expected, the results of these evictions have not contributed to a significant lowering of the number of unhoused people in the community, but instead have served only to shuffle people to other locations, increase suffering and emotional trauma, create unnecessary negative interactions with neighboring property owners, and concentrate people in the Comanche Creek area. It's reasonable to assume that the clearing of this much larger concentration of people in Comanche Creek will have serious impacts not only on the physical and mental health of the displaced, but would lead to more fragmented dispersion of campers into new areas of the community, into residential neighborhoods, business districts, and deeper into our parks, creating more community strife and problems. Furthermore, the temporary restraining order placed on the city disallows any anti-camping actions or evictions until the court has determined if adequate space for shelter is available.
We lost on Friday.
If this happens and the council fails to identify adequate shelter space, campsites that the council recently authorized tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars to clear could see camps reestablished. This would be antithetical to the council's intent, all because no plan was developed for a sanctioned alternative.
What did you do during that whole time you were in charge, you guys? Nothing.
As I mentioned, data being
Absolutely
referenced
nothing.
and presented to the public as
You're lying to
supposed
people.
proof that we do not need additional shelter beds has been misunderstood at best and misrepresented at worst.
Trying to make a video. Would you please be quiet?
The issue is not as simple as the presence or absence of overnight shelter beds. Not all beds are created
Stop blocking
equal,
my shot.
and while the housing and shelter programs in place are essential, lumping them together as accessible beds is misleading. Let me explain using the 2020 homeless inventory count provided by the Continuum of Care. Folks, can we please be respectful and polite of each other as we're engaged? Please.
Listen to her, she's telling lies.
These beds, the most accessible emergency shelter beds in our community are currently located at Torres Community Shelter. As of yesterday, the Torres shelter has
Get away from me. Do not touch me. Get away from me.
Why don't you get away from us?
You're about as respectful as a fucking flea, you ass bite.
I'm an ass bite. I'm a respectful
Folks, we're
flea.
please
Thank
asking for
you.
respect of each other.
Get away from me.
Elderly people, you swing
Please.
I'd swing at anybody. If I swung at somebody, they'd be on the ground.
Yeah, right. Let our council people speak.
You're touching me.
Folks, the most accessible emergency shelter beds in our community are currently located at the Torres Community Shelter. As of yesterday, the Torres shelter had 36. These beds were and are available to new program participants only, meaning that previous participants must set an appointment with a case manager in order to access them at all. Additionally, participants cannot bring their pets into shelter, which means in order to access a bed, they would need to choose between being with their animal or having a legal place to sleep. Beds available through behavioral health cannot be reserved and are designated for people experiencing behavioral health or substance use disorders. Beds available through CalWorks cannot be reserved and are focused on permanent housing, and they have eligibility requirements. Beds available through the Chico Housing Action Team are not emergency shelter beds at all. but are permanent supportive housing, a service that we are glad exists. But for these beds, there are long waiting lists, and due to city enforcement, they may actually be threatened, or some of these beds may actually be threatened. Many beds referenced in the homeless inventory count are for permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and transitional housing. And many are for special populations, such as people with behavioral health concerns or disabilities, people who can participate in sober living environments, and people who have experienced domestic violence. Every single one of these services is necessary, but they do not represent accessible emergency shelter opportunities. What's more, as it relates to transitional housing and permanent supportive housing, the vast majority of these options are full. As many of us know, Safe Space Winter Shelter has ended its season, leading to additional medically fragile people being discharged to our streets with no place to go. Some of these people have access to vehicles, but with no legal place for car camping, they are subject to city enforcement. We are seeing numbers shared about beds coming online in the next year or more. While we are hopeful for these projects to come to fruition, we cannot depend on beds that do not yet exist to meet the needs of our current unhoused community. These projects are always subject to funding restrictions, zoning approvals, and more, issues that have stalled or derailed other housing and shelter programs in the past. We have a housing and shelter crisis right now, and future beds do not confront that crisis with urgency. In spite of the previous council's vote to support the Torres sheltering and increasing their shelter capacity by 50 beds, which is slated to come online this year, we still have a lot of work to do. And the reality is, as of today, the city of Chico has 0 emergency shelter beds available that are no barrier or very low barrier. This means that people struggling with substances, people with pets, or people for whom congregate sheltering environments are not accessible due to trauma, PTSD, and other concerns cannot access shelter, as they are being told they cannot legally sit, lie, or rest in the city of Chico. Councilmember Huber and myself have been advocating heartily for safe, sanctioned outdoor sheltering environments, such as a campground or pallet shelter, for the entire tenure on this council. Most recently, on April 6th, I brought forward yet another request for council to utilize city-owned property to develop an outdoor sheltering environment. We outlined the need for this type of environment as a critical part of the continuum of services offered for those who face barriers in accessing congregate shelters. We did this with the absolute expectation that this council would make a financial investment in developing the environment and soliciting support from a local service provider to manage it. The council voted 5-2, not only to reject the proposal, but to rescind the shelter crisis declaration in its entirety, arguing that because there are a small number of open beds at the Torres shelter, people on our streets don't want shelter and are therefore beyond help. This was not an agenda item up for discussion. And the result of a reactionary decision like this is that the very service providers currently offering shelter and support to people experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness will lose critical funding for those services. Here are a few of the current programs that will suffer as a result of this decision. True North Housing Alliance will no longer be able to utilize funding for day services, shelter services, and Aurora North housing services. The Chico Housing Action Team and Community Action Agency will no longer be able to use funding for rental subsidies to keep people housed. Caminar will no longer be eligible to utilize funding to improve their facilities. This decision may also impact service providers who are offering services throughout Butte County, including Ampla Health's mobile medical unit providing health care to people experiencing homelessness, Youth for Change's case management services for homeless and runaway youth, and Catalyst Domestic Violence Services for victims and survivors of domestic violence, many of whom are homeless as the result of being in an abusive relationship. We have consulted further with the COC and county and have a bit more context to provide you on what this amounts to. It is estimated that funding granted by the COC through the Housing Emergency Aid Program, or HEAP, that will be lost is $420,000. California Emergency Solutions in Housing, or CESH funding, awarded in 2018, would account for an additional $219,000 in loss for local service providers. Finally, 2019 CESH funds, which granted $208,000 to True North Housing Alliance for emergency shelter services, would be lost. These are massive dollar amounts for local nonprofits that have already been awarded this funding. But this is only the tip of the iceberg of dismantling essential and often life-saving services. Should the council either formally rescind the shelter crisis declaration or let it expire in June of this year, service providers in Chico may not even be eligible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in future state funding to expand, sustain, or enhance their services. I can assure you that the crisis we have now will only be exacerbated by stripping service providers of access to these necessary funding streams.
As an incremental step towards sheltering, we're asking our fellow councilors tonight to join us in agendizing discussion and action leading to the expedited identification of a sanctioned campground location and direction to city staff to make the needed arrangements to implement a plan making such a campground operational.
Yes.
We're asking that previously considered and or rejected locations be reevaluated and that staff provide an assessment of the following additional locations for discussion and consideration of action by the council, including any and all city-owned parcels, portions of the BMX track, the Ed McLaughlin property off Cohasset Road, city property near the airport, portions of the Seidenglans property off Hagen, which previously was used for FEMA fire victims, the Life Touch property on Morrow Lane, the McGowan property on Morrow Lane, city-owned property near the intersection of Bruce Road and Humboldt Road, the Lottie property on Eaton Road, any and all other properties that may be suitable. In the interim, we call on the City Council to remediate some of the effects of those seeking shelter in public places, adequate waste disposal facilities. Finally, we're asking that this council take ownership of the crisis of homelessness by committing funding to implementing these projects so that we can do our part in clearing the way for service providers to do what they do best. Communities such as Santa Rosa have taken the bold step of establishing sanctioned campgrounds and found that the community came around to not only accepting but supporting the project after it was successfully implemented and managed. In Elk Grove, the city is currently piloting a program to pay people to clean their encampments, saving the city thousands of dollars in staff time and equipment, and helping residents to connect to more stable housing and support. There's no shortage of models and success stories for us to reference and use in our next step, and it's critical that we act. After voting to rescind the shelter crisis, Council was informed by staff that this action had to be made final by resolution. This means that the shelter crisis declaration is still in place until that action is taken or until the shelter crisis declaration expires in June. As we've made clear using data in context, we are far from being out of this crisis. Just like hundreds of cities across our state and our country, we need all the help we can get. The shelter crisis declaration is what made safe space operable over the cold winter months this year. It's what makes developing tiny home villages and temporary shelter easier to develop. If we're going to face the housing and homelessness crisis with solutions in mind and ensure that service providers and experts have access to the funding they need, the vote to rescind the declaration must be reconsidered. We're asking that the council reconsider this vote as soon as possible. We're also asking that the council extend the shelter crisis declaration for at least another 2 years so that we can remove as many barriers to housing and shelter as possible and ensure access to funding for essential and innovative programs to continue operating and expanding. We ask that community members contact their city councilors and request that councilors take immediate action to provide an alternative, sanctioned campsite, not only to help assure the physical and mental well-being of our unhoused residents, but to avoid the community-wide crisis of dispersing individuals throughout the city without a plan. We also ask that community members continue to demand that the shelter crisis declaration be extended for the next 2 years or more, so that programs and projects that are helping to confront our crisis can do so with the state and city support. Now's the time to stand behind services, shelter, and ultimately a housing first approach to this issue.
Thank you all so much for being here. We do have to get to another council meeting, but we will happily take questions offline from the media after closed session and during breaks, and we're prepared to provide any further comment as needed through email or phone interviews, or if you have questions, you can contact us as well. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Danny, you have somebody, Danny, I saw you here. Do you have somebody to take care of the podium?
Yes, I'll take care of it.
Okay, thank you.